Hello and welcome to the IEA channel. I'm Emma Revel, Head of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And don't forget, whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening to us on Apple, Spotify or Podbean, click subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. And if you have been enjoying the IEA's digital output during lockdown, you can support our work by making a donation. Visit iea.org.uk to find out how. Complaints about left-wing bias in the film industry are not new. You can find articles from as far back as the 1930s in which right-wing commentators lambast Hollywood as essentially an outpost of the Soviet Union. Today, the woke virtue-signalling actor ready to jump on any fashionable left-wing bandwagon has become a popular cliche. But cliches, of course, often contain a large grain of truth. Since the beginning of lockdown, the average Brit is watching an hour a day more television, and I'm not sure who these average Brits are because I'm certainly watching more than an hour. But whether you're embracing Netflix or whether you think we should be spending a bit more time outside exercising, movies and TV series are a bigger part of our lives than ever before. And while we at the IEA are not going to become the Institute of Cinematic Affairs, this seems like a good time as any to take a closer look at the bad economics in popular films. So today I'm joined by my colleague, Christian Niemitz, who's our head of political economy, who's been trying his luck as a film reviewer over for CapX. We're going to discuss the film The Platform, which I have seen, as well as the series Snowpiercer, which I haven't. Christian has kindly watched them both for us, so you don't have to, which are two dystopian science fiction thrillers, both released this year. So Christian, like I said, I've seen The Platform, which is a Spanish language film set in a futuristic prison with hundreds of floors. It's 2 prisoners per floor, with floors randomly allocated and changing each month. Food travels between the floors on a lift, starting at the top, so prisoners on higher floors are able to gulp down as much food as possible, while those on lower floors are left to fight over the scraps, or indeed starve. So far, so good on the cliched metaphor for capitalism, but what's the story with Snowpiercer?
It's a somewhat similar metaphor. Rather than a tower, there it's a train. The train is symbolizing capitalism. It's set in a post-apocalyptic world. The world has ended due to climate change. What else? Except it's not climate change as such. It's people react to climate change with a form of geoengineering, and that goes horribly wrong. It starts a new ice age and everybody freezes to death, except for a few people who manage to save themselves on an ark of sorts, except it's a train. It's a massive train with, I think they mentioned a number, I think it's 1,001 carriages, and it travels permanently around the world, never stops for a second, and it is a society of sorts. They still have plenty of leftovers from before the apocalypse, and they even have a little bit of production going on board of the train, so that they grow their own food in there. They have a carriage which is a glass house of sorts, and it's meant to be a metaphor for capitalism in the sense that you have a very unequal distribution of resources. You have the first carriages, they represent the upper class, so there everyone lives in luxury. And but as you move towards the rear end of the train, things get worse and worse. And at the rear end, you have people living in abject poverty. So it's overcrowded, and they get meager food rations, and it looks very much like a Victorian slum. And then you have carriages in between. You have the second class carriages represent the, I guess, upper middle class, the third class being the lower middle class. And what happens is that even though there are far more poor people on the train, I think in the third episode even somebody puts a number on it. They say the tail end and the third class taken together are something like 70% of all the people on board of the train. So clearly they are the vast majority. But they don't stick together. They work against each other. They lack class consciousness, and that's a conventional Marxist critique, that the working class, the proletariat, lacks class consciousness. They don't realize that they are the majority, that they are on the same side, and that they should actually team up and get together and overthrow the bourgeoisie, overthrow the ruling class, and take over the economy. And that doesn't happen, at least so far. I mean, it's a series. There've only been 3 episodes so far. Who knows? Maybe it ends with a socialist revolution of sorts. But so far, that's the way it works.
That seems like quite an unlikely finale. Obviously, these films and series are meant to be metaphors for capitalism. So what's wrong with that? Why do you think they're not capturing capitalism as it actually happens on the ground?
Yes, well, I don't know how you would represent capitalism. What would be a good metaphor for that? I guess that would be quite tricky to do. But whatever it is, neither of those 2 movies have managed to do it. Both are absolutely terrible metaphors, mostly because, well, first of all, they're both zero-sum economies. The platform, quite literally, as you said, there's this concrete slab which just has a lot of food on it. It comes out of nowhere. We never quite learn where this food supply comes from, and it doesn't matter for the purposes of the movie. It is somehow there. There's this fixed pot of resources, and the economy, such as it is just about distributing whatever there is. There is no way somebody could come up in this movie with a method of increasing the food supply, that you could have people on the lower floors starting to grow their own food, or somebody coming up with a new method and raising productivity in food production, something like that. That can't happen. Supply is totally fixed. To a lesser extent, that's true on the Snowpiercer as well. Yes, there is a bit of food production happening, but mostly people live off what they've inherited from before the apocalypse, and even production is very limited. Space is very limited. There is no way in which they could, for example, bring in new capital goods or add a new carriage to the train and therefore create more space for everyone. There is no way in which you can grow the pie. There is, in both cases, a fixed amount of resources. And what's probably even worse than that is that there is no exchange going on. There is no division of labor. There is nothing that we would recognize as market transactions. There's literally none whatsoever in the platform, and only very little and at the margins in Snowpiercer. And of course, in a market economy, the distribution of resources is determined by exchange, by voluntary exchange. If you want to make money in a market economy, you have to offer other people something that they want and are prepared to pay for. There is no other way you can make money in a market economy. So therefore, the people who get rich in a market economy must have been entrepreneurial in some way. They can have inherited it as well. But then somebody at some stage must have found a way of convincing other people to part with some of their money, or in those cases it would be a non-monetary economy. But you will have to convince other people to part with some of their resources and give them to you and offer them something in return. And that is the way you get rich. That's not what happens in either of these movies. Some people are just rich. It's for no reason whatsoever, completely random. And that's why they're terrible metaphors for capitalism. I guess you could, even if you represented capitalism in a more realistic way, you could still make a critical case. I'm not saying that as soon as I'm not trying to define a realistic metaphor for capitalism in such a way that you can only make a pro-capitalist case. You could still have a story in which, let's say, there are rich merchants. There are some people who get rich. You acknowledge that they do something useful, that they provide some useful goods and services, but you can still portray them as greedy and cruel figures. I would have been okay with that sort of critique. But what you can't do, and imply that this is a metaphor for capitalism, is have some people who just for no reason whatsoever have lots of money or lots of wealth, lots of resources, because the trouble is, if you have a non-economic setting, which is what those movies are, there is no economy as such. In a non-economic setting, there is indeed no good reason why some people should have more than others. And in a setting like that, even I, as a free market economist, would not be wouldn't see a reason for defending the rich, because they are just rich randomly. It's not that they have had some great entrepreneurial idea. It's really just pure chance. They have monopolized the resources. They got there early on. They were lucky in some way, and that's all there is to it. And that's why that is just very, very far away from how a capitalist economy works.
I mean, there's a paradox here, isn't there? You know, successful capitalist countries producing anti-capitalist movies. I mean, you're not going to get, you know, cinemas in Cuba or the state in North Korea making films that portray socialism in a negative light, right?
That's right, and that in itself proves a major plank of Marxism wrong, which is a bit ironic because these movies clearly have a quasi-Marxist message. But Marx had this idea that the dominant ideas of every time, the ruling ideas, are always the ideas of the ruling class. Marxists believe that ideas, or that there isn't really such a thing as ideas. Ideas don't lead a life of their own. Ideas are always just disguised class interests. You come up with ideas because they serve your economic class, the class you belong to, which is defined by your relation to the means of production. You're either an owner of the means of production or you're not. And the ideas that you come up with are just rationalizations for your class interests. Looking back from the time when Marx was writing this, historically, this was often true. You could say that in the Middle Ages, you had a class of feudal landowners, and land was the means of production in the Middle Ages. And they had to come up with ways of justifying that, rationalizing that. And that's why you get ideas about the aristocracy being the representatives of God in this world, and them aligning with the church, and somehow coming up with a reason why they should have those resources. And you have the same in slave owning societies, that you need to have some idea why they are supposedly in some way superior to the slaves, and why this is also the will of God, or however you rationalize it. But either way, the law and traditions and religion would just be justifications for the existing economic order. That was the Marxist idea. He applied that to capitalism as well, except it doesn't work at all for capitalism, because if that were true, you would expect lots of movies or other cultural products that would depict entrepreneurs as noble wealth creators. You would expect every other movie to be as if the screenplay had been written by Ayn Rand. You would expect lots of Atlas Shrugged variations in which you have a noble upper class who create tons of wealth, and they're just great people all around. And then you have looters who try to unjustly appropriate some of that wealth without having to work for it. But the fact that we remember Ayn Rand isn't that she was so brilliant. She really wasn't. It's just that this type of fiction is so unusual. If you think of examples, well, Ayn Rand would always be the first thing that comes to mind, and then there would be a long pause, a long period of silence. This really is a very unusual depiction. But if Marx had been right about that, about the dominant ideas being the ideas of the ruling class, as he defined it, the class that means that owns the means of production, then you would expect that would be the normal representation of capitalism in culture. You would have lots of Ayn Rand type characters, noble wealth creators, and that is not at all what we see. It's the absolute opposite, and that shows that Marx was wrong. Owning productive assets, owning machinery or factories or whatever, does not mean that you have any cultural power. You can be rich in monetary terms. That doesn't mean that you have any cultural influence. That really is a completely separate sphere.
I mean, that leads me nicely into my next question, which was going to be, how much of an issue is this within kind of not just films, but sort of wider popular culture? Is this a couple of rogue films just pushing a really economically illiterate agenda? Or actually, I mean, there are plenty of films that do with a capitalist message, but the capitalist character, I suppose, is usually, as you said earlier, greedy, selfish. You know, we might have picked two quite severe examples, I suppose, to write about in your CapX article, but this kind of anti-capitalist message, how common is that in sort of our wider culture?
It's hard to say, because I normally try not to concentrate on the politics of a movie, because I know that would just ruin the movie for me. Yes, I sometimes read James Delingpole's movie reviews in The Spectator, and he easily detects some underlying woke message, and he's probably right about that. It's just, you can tell that totally ruins almost every movie for him, and I don't want to go down that road. It's just the cultural bias is what it is, and I still want to be able to enjoy movies nonetheless. I normally try not to pay attention to that, but I have seen a couple of qualitative studies that do argue. They review a couple of high-profile movies and series, and they do say that entrepreneurs are usually characterized as villains, portrayed in a negative way, or wealthy people more generally are characterized as in some way dysfunctional, competent, yes, but also cold-hearted, so that there is that cliche. But I'm a bit skeptical about, or let's just say, I wouldn't read too much into that, because I would say, well, in a movie, someone has to be the villain. If it's about a murder, somebody has to be the murderer, and why shouldn't that be the entrepreneur? It could sometimes be, rather than an overt anti-entrepreneur agenda, it could just be that it helps the storyline if the villain has lots of money, because the villain does something that is resource intensive. Being a villain is just expensive, and therefore there has to be some plausible reason why they have all this money. And one way of doing that would be, oh, they're a successful entrepreneur. And that's the reason why you could say this cuts both ways. In Batman, the good guy, Bruce Wayne, is also a millionaire. Now, that's not because they're trying to say that millionaires are good people. It's just that Batman has lots of very expensive, customized equipment.
Exactly.
And it would be hard to
yourself, right?
Yeah, exactly. It would be hard to then say, oh, and he also works as a think tank researcher. Then he probably wouldn't have anything like the arsenal that he has. So therefore, I wouldn't read too much into this. That's a bit like saying there's lots of movies in which the villain is German. Now that is not a Teutophobic bias. That's simply because thousands of movies are set either during the Second World War or during the Cold War. So the baddie is either a Nazi or an East German communist. It's just that it would be less spectacular to make a movie that's set in post-war West Germany, where you would just show people peacefully going about their business, reconstructing the country, and so on. Okay, but there's just less of an obvious storyline here. So I'd say mostly it's more of a woke bias. That is clearly true, but that's more the cultural side rather than the economics. Anti-wealth, yes. Anti-capitalist. It would be more subtle normally. It wouldn't be as in your face as it is in the movies that we've just discussed.
Okay, so my last question was just going to be linked to what we've just discussed. You know, your book, Socialism, The Failed Idea That Never Dies, looks at why this sort of narrative, this ideology, won't go away, even though every time it's tried, every practical example that we can look at is a disaster. Do you think that's because, or in part, obviously there's a lot of contributing factors, but do you think it is due to the sort of positive portrayal in popular culture and films and stuff, or do you think that the positive portrayals in films are because it keeps failing in real life, so they need to make it look good on screen in a fictional world?
Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and egg question. It could also just be that because we have this anti-market, pro-socialist zeitgeist, that's why there is a demand for that type of movie, that type of message in a movie, that a movie that had an overt pro-capitalist agenda would just get a very bad rating. It would just be dismissed as propaganda. And therefore, maybe even if there is if there was a libertarian filmmaker, there must be some. They might be tempted to self-censor or just keep that very subtle. And it's therefore hard to say which comes first. But yeah, I guess it must be a reason. If you take the Hayekian line, I mean, Hayek wrote this paper in the late 1940s, The Intellectuals and Socialism, and he talked about how people who work in the business of ideas have a disproportionate influence on the general thinking, the general spirit of the age. He said it's a mistake to think that this is just that the intellectuals are just a small bubble and it's not important for the real world. That would be like people today saying, "Oh, Twitter is not the real world. Twitter is just a bubble." But that's not true. That's not how it works. Hayek said, in an economy that relies on the division of labor, just as we don't bake our own bread and we don't brew our own beer, we don't produce our own ideas either. We get them from ideas wholesalers and ideas retailers, and these are the people he meant by when he said the intellectuals. He didn't necessarily just mean academics. He meant very broadly people who work in the business of ideas. These can be the media sector, the education sector, but also very much the cultural sector. And because these people specialize on that, and where else would you get them from? And therefore, these people do have a disproportionate influence, and it does radiate outwards, even if you're not aware of it. If somebody asks you, how did you form your political views, you probably wouldn't say, it's this movie that I watched 3 years ago and that novel I read 4 years ago. They had this implicit anti-capitalist depiction of the wealthy as greedy exploiters, and that's why I think that way. But it could just be the idea that you then pick up the cues in that way. And Hayek did say, therefore, that's how the British post-war consensus developed, that long before there was a policy agenda of nationalizing industries and creating a state-run health service and all the rest of that, that before all that, you had British intellectuals giving up on liberalism, Britain being originally the motherland of liberalism, then the intellectuals giving up on that, socialist ideas or statist ideas, more generally collectivist ideas, becoming the mainstream, and then at some point it became policy. It would be hard to come up with an exact roadmap for how that worked, but that was his theory, and yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. And if that is true, then you wouldn't exclude movies.
It all feeds into the sort of general narrative of the society, I suppose.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Christian, for joining me today. Don't forget, if you've been watching or listening to us, you can subscribe on YouTube, or if you're listening to a podcast, on Apple, Spotify, or Podbean. You can also subscribe to our IEA Daily newsletter, which will give you all of the updates on any upcoming podcasts, videos, webinars, news, views, and events, including the IEA's traditional publications. If you have been particularly enjoying our output during lockdown, you can support our work. You can sign up to IEA Daily or donate by visiting the IEA website on iea.org.uk.